Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this Giving Tuesday. I hope everyone found a way to give back in some way today. And we're so pleased that you joined us with us this evening. As Mini Cans gears up for our next grant cycle, which is going to kick off in January, we've invited two special guests and philanthropy experts to join us for this important conversation tonight. I'm so pleased to welcome Kathy Kretman and Tamara Copeland. Hi, ladies.
Katy.
So, Kathy leads the Center for Public and Nonprofit Leadership at Georgetown. She's a research professor there, and she's the Nielsen Chair in Philanthropy. As director of Georgetown's internationally recognized nonprofit executive program, she's helped train more than 1,500 nonprofit leaders. It's very impressive. Thank you for joining us, Kathy. I had the pleasure of working with Tamara for more than a decade at the Washington Regional Association of Grantmakers, which we lovingly refer to as RAG. As president of RAG, Tamara conceptualized and led Putting Racism on the Table. It's a multi-year initiative that helped local funders understand how structural racism and implicit bias contribute to the social ills they're trying to address. She's also a prolific writer and author. Her book, Daughters of the Dream, was published in 2018, and you can read her writing on the regular at her blog, Daughters of the Dream. Welcome to both of you. So together, Tamara and Kathy taught a course at Georgetown that was titled Philanthropy, Power, and Impact. And that course explored the complex relationship between funders and nonprofits. Many of us in Many Hands have experienced that when we've gone through the grants process, we've gone on site visits. And so we'll be pulling on Kathy and Tamara's experience and expertise tonight as we explore philanthropy's inherent power imbalance, the role that philanthropy can play in advancing racial justice, and the challenge and opportunities that funders face as we examine our work through a racial equity lens. So thanks so much, and we're excited to get started. Tamara, I'm going to start with you. While at RAG, you launched Putting Racism on the Table. Could you tell us a little bit about that body of work and what the motivations were?
So it was an effort to really look at the depth and breadth and impact of structural racism and implicit bias. And the immediate motivator was the death of Freddie Gray in Baltimore. And Freddie Gray was an African-American young man who died as the result of injuries he suffered at the back of a police vehicle. And so that was really what precipitated the conversation among local philanthropic leaders. But I think there was also a desire, Katy, to look beyond the presenting problem. When Mary did her introduction, she talked about all of the data and the predominance of African-American or communities of color in statistics that suggest negative outcomes. And I think everyone within the philanthropic community was aware of that and wanted to dig a little deeper and look at some of the issues around race and racism that were contributing to some of the problems we're seeing in the region.
Thanks. So now that almost 5 years have passed since the launch of that initiative, as you reflect on that work, what do you think the impact has been?
Well, let's just start with conversations like this one. I mean, I think that there would not have been this conversation 5 years ago. So that's the conversations like this, there are dinner table conversations, there are dinner groups, so there's a host of things. But I also think that that funders' voices are very powerful. And when the philanthropic community started talking about structural racism, systemic racism, then I think folks perked up and realized that they were having a conversation that went beyond the DEI conversation that we had been having for a little while. So I think that that certainly the philanthropic community was able to set a tone. There are a growing number of funders, as you well know, that are addressing racism in a very different way. There was an Arts Forward fund that a number of funders pooled their resources recently. Racial equity was part of the lens. The COVID-19 response, again, racial equity was a part of the lens. There have been changes in the way funders do their grant making. The Meyer Foundation just announced the Fund for Black-Led Change. The Weisberg Foundation, very proudly on their homepage, talks about disrupting and dismantling racism. So I think that the commitment to diversifying staffs, to diversifying boards, is pretty significant, and I think that some of that started with the work that we did around putting racism on the table. And then I think that there are other organizations that have picked up that mantle. Through your service on the board of Leadership Greater Washington, that Doug Duncan and LGW is doing a series now. The Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, Chuck Bean and the folks there have been doing a series on race and racism with their governmental leaders. And Housing Association for Nonprofit Developers, HAN, Heather Raspberry has been doing work. So there's been lots of ripples that have happened because of it. But I think that it's important to recognize that not only are organizations doing work, but individuals are doing work again through dinner groups and conversations and book clubs. So it's pretty exciting to see what's happened, I think, with that starting some of that work.
Yeah, you can feel and see the ripple effects. Thank you for that work, Tamara. And we will put some of the resources that we're mentioning into the chat thread here. Puttingracismonthetable.org is still up and live. There are 6 videos at least, and a couple of podcasts as well that people can watch, and they're pretty great. And they have discussion guides and the whole bit.
Yep.
Kathy, I'd like to go over to you now. I'd like to hear the story about how you and Tamara met. Oh, you're on mute, Kathy.
Am I still on mute?
No.
You would think I would have this down given the fact that I teach all the time on Zoom now, but never do. First of all, I just want to say thank you so much for inviting us to speak. I remember when I taught philanthropy class years ago, and one of my first guest speakers was Susie Berenson, who was your founder, and I believe. And Wendy Gray was part of our center before too. So I just want a shout out to her. So Tamara and I met, I think Tamara was about 15 years ago. Mm-hmm. And we were part of a small group that someone put together, a colleague put together. The small group was about 6 or 7 nonprofit executive directors in the district to talk about, it was like an affinity group, to talk about our issues, challenges, and just to be a support group for each other. Tamara and I would meet, we met there. We would come early all the time because we were early birds, and we would sit and get to know each other better. And from there, we decided to walk. We became walking buddies. And, you know, when you walk and talk all over the city, you really get to know each other. We know our personal different things we're going through professionally. We went back and forth on talking about what RAG was doing. And I would push back and Tamara would push back on me. And so I felt like I was part of the process with that. But it evolved into a wonderful friendship and professional relationship, and then us co-teaching together.
Love it. Well, that's a perfect segue, because I'd really like to have you tell us a little bit about the class that you and Tamara taught at Georgetown. What was the impetus and focus for that?
I was asked by my dean if I wanted to be what's called the Nielsen Chair in Philanthropy. Waldemar Nielsen worked at the Ford Foundation many years ago, and he wrote a seminal book that was a critique of philanthropy. So we had the endowed chair. So my dean asked if I wanted to be it. And I said, well, what do you want me to do? And he said, well, you tell me what you want to do. And I said, I want to teach a class on philanthropy, and I'm on philanthropy specifically on racial equity. And I want to invite Tamara Copeland to co-teach it with me. And that's the main thing I want to do. And he would look dubious, and he said, well, you could teach anything about philanthropy, but why racial equity? And I was a little taken aback. I said, well, one thing, I think it's really important. Here's the work that Tamara's doing at RAG. Philanthropists are looking at this. Think about what's going on in society. And I've been at the center, my center at Georgetown, been doing a lot of work around, I was working on a project, the racial wealth divide, in 4 different cities, and providing capacity building work for organizations in those 4 cities that were led by people of color, serving communities of color. Baltimore, Chicago, New Orleans, and Miami. So this was near and dear to my heart, why I wanted to do it. But I'll just tell you quickly, I also circle back. When I first came to DC many years ago in the early 70s, I worked for the US Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. And I worked on voting rights. I worked on police brutality, employment, some of the same things, issues that we see now. And so when he asked why I wanted to do it, it was that combination of factors, and that was the impetus for why we wanted to teach the class together. And then I asked Tamara, and she said yes.
I remember when she said yes. We talked about it as a staff at RAG and what it would mean, and we were so excited about it. As we many hands are really at the beginning of our racial equity learning journey as an organization, it'd be helpful, I think, for many of us to hear, how did you prepare to teach this course? What did you read? What did you try to figure out and learn? That would help us on our own learning journey.
Do you want to take that first, Tamara? You want me to?
It's yours, Kathy.
Okay. Well, the first thing we wanted to, it's a little bit different. We decided we wanted the class to be experiential learning, because how do you teach grant making unless you really have hands-on? So I went back to a foundation. Actually, Warren Buffett's big sister, she just passed away, Doris Buffett, had a foundation, Learning by Giving. And I said I wanted to teach this class on racial equity, and it's never been done before. And I need $10,000. And McCourt, the school I'm in at Georgetown, was going to match it. And they thought, oh my God, they never heard of a philanthropy and racial equity class. And they said, oh yeah, they're on it. So I went back to McCourt and said to the dean, we're getting 10,000, but we need to match it here. And so they matched it. So the students had $20,000 to learn to give out. And then Tamara and I, we designed the class around their giving, their grant making experience. So our objectives were learning about grant making, learning about nonprofits, and then also learning with an overlay of a racial equity lens. So in terms of what we read, I think we spent a lot of time on this. We were really serious about it. We talked to each other. We talked about what the field, we reviewed. There wasn't a whole lot in the field of philanthropy and racial equity. Let's just put that out there. There is very little. And so we had to piecemeal a lot of different things, both current readings, former. We weren't really happy in the beginning with some of the readings that were just the old stodgy white men readings. And so we ended up recreating what we thought were really good articles, blogs. And then, yeah. So in answer to your question, when we started this, the readings were very sparse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So a lot has happened in society since you ladies both started teaching this course. Any aha moments for you over the course of teaching, or has this course changed over time?
Well, I think when Kathy said there weren't a lot of books out there, I think the release of Edgar Villanueva's book, Decolonizing Wealth, did change the way that we, or some of the information that we shared with the students. But, you know, the people within the local philanthropic community, many of them were guest speakers for the class. And they were very candid in sharing what philanthropy is really like and how they were trying to utilize a racial equity lens in the work that they were doing. So I think that the class did evolve, but not in a significant way. I mean, I think. What do you think, Kathy?
I was trying to, the aha moments, I was trying to think about that. And I think, first of all, I would also say the book Decolonizing Wealth, for all of you who haven't read it, I think it's the best. I really do. I think it was terrific. I think that students got the most out of the guest speakers, and also actually that book. I think the students got a lot out of the fact that Tamara and I were co-teaching it together, and we were totally honest, I think. They saw the trust that we had in each other. They saw how we played off of each other. They saw how we were vulnerable. And I think that helped their learning, that vulnerability and trust. As one student later on in another class said, and an aha moment for me is change happens at the speed of trust. And I think all the work that we're doing around racial equity, when you think about it, this is for the long haul. But if you don't have the trust, I don't know how you can move forward. That gets, by the way, back to the dinner, having dinner discussions and groups together. I think that's critically important. And the students found in the class, I think, that we created that space that they could be vulnerable. Mm-hmm. I think that was one of the greatest things they got out of it. How it evolved, I think they have learned in the first class and the third class and all the way through. One of the big takeaways for them is one for, I think, the field of philanthropy. It's not enough to fund programs. They learned that there's nothing wrong and there's a need for funding operations, administrative costs. They often said, and this was all the way through, who am I, the student, to be determining who gets what money and how much and for what? So that was a great, I think, it wasn't aha, but I think it certainly, it touched me.
Can I just add one thing, Katy, about an aha moment that I had was just realizing how inclusive the student communities are, racially inclusive, but how there is a significant lack of understanding about structural racism. Significant. It's not something that they had been exposed to. There was not something that they had learned in previous environments. And just to recognize that the importance of understanding how we got here and how embedded some of these practices and policies are in ways that are pretty invisible. So I think it was important that at McCourt in the School of Public Policy, that these students who were going to go off into significant jobs, I would imagine, that they have a hand in shaping public policy in this country, that we were able to expose them to a structural reality around racism that they were typically unaware of.
Can I add one point? One thing that evolved, it wasn't so much the students thinking, but it was Georgetown's and the professors. And when we started, as I said, professors and the dean, like, why are you doing this? 3 years later, they're saying, you have to do this. And how are you doing this? So I think it's hit upon a nerve.
Great. More ripple effects, right?
Yeah.
So there's so much good content here. I want to unpack a few things. In particular, one of the themes of your course seems to hover around power. And during many Jens grant rounds and site visits, so many of us who have served on focus area committees and gone on site visits, we've felt the responsibility and the power and the privilege of our position as decision makers, just like your students did. So we realized that we are the gatekeepers to the resources that these organizations need. So how can we and other funders address and acknowledge this kind of inherent power imbalance between grant makers and grant seekers?
Well, I suspect we both have an answer for that question. Starting out with actually saying the words out loud, that when you're talking with potential grantees or with grantees, just to acknowledge that you recognize that there's a power imbalance and to say the words. I think that most people believe that funders don't know that, when most funders certainly do. But I think what happens is that many funders don't go beyond recognizing it. How do you become collaborators with the community that you want to serve? How do you engage them by asking what kind of help do they need? I think there are often assumptions made as programs are developed, as opposed to asking the community what do they need and how do they want that support given. So going beyond trying to support the needs of the community, but to actively engage the community in helping to shape the grants and to shape the manner in which you support them.
That's great. As we go a little deeper into that question, I love your insights. And are there ways that we and or funders can look to share and build power in the organizations and the communities that we support?
Well, first of all, I agree with what Tamara said. And I think, and people are some new trends around talking about philanthropy. It's participatory philanthropy. It's trust-based philanthropy. Participatory is bringing in the communities you want to serve into helping you determine what your criteria is. And so engaging them in the process, it really is turning over some power that people are often uncomfortable with, but engaging them from the beginning in what are their needs and what kind of investment can you make in them. I think the investment goes beyond program delivery, and it's talking to them what they need, but it's more long-term investments. And so multi-year, it's realizing you're in it for the long haul. So it's investing also in their own capacity as leaders, and for sustainable organizations. That investment is critical, especially for leaders of color and community-based organizations. They often don't have the opportunities to go to some of the leadership development and different kinds of trainings. They also don't have money to bring in facilitators to do some of the kinds of work that they want and need to do, like larger organizations. So those are just a couple things.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So I want to dive a little deeper into the idea of funding racial equity and racial justice. So, over the way we think about philanthropy's history over the last 100 years or so, we've poured billions of dollars into nonprofit organizations who are doing quote unquote good work. And while there's no doubt that really good work has happened, racial disparities still abound, right? As we look at income and home ownership and health outcomes, educational attainment, the list goes on and on. So even with Grantmakers' increased awareness of these disparities, their willingness to invest in organizations led by people of color seems to remain really low. So what do you guys think is driving this reluctance? And what do you think that philanthropy needs to do in order to change this behavior, this practice?
Kathy, should I start this one?
Yes.
Katy, I think part of it is a general lack of authentic relationships between Black leaders and white leaders. You probably know this data better than I do, but BoardSource came out with a report in 2017. They may have updated it recently, and you would know that, I know. But BoardSource came out with a report in 2017 where they showed that the number of board members of color had not changed. The diversity of boards hadn't changed since 2015. So and I think they do the study every 2 years. And when you recognize that boards are the places who are making decisions about who the leaders are of the nonprofit organizations, that I just think that there aren't those kind of authentic relationships. There wasn't a Black leader of a Fortune 500 company until 1999. That was just 20 years ago. So what are those networks where you learn about what the jobs are? What are those networks that look like you when you're thinking about who should be a leader? Who is a leader and what does a leader look like? So I think that part of it is that we just don't have people sufficient numbers of people in positions of authority making those decisions about who the next leader is going to be. I think there's also this dimension of fear from the white community, and I'm likening it to desegregation of neighborhoods. So when housing neighborhoods were being desegregated, there was the notion among the realtor community and among leaders, civic leaders, that if 5% of the neighborhood was people of color, that was okay. That could be tolerated. When it got to 10% people of color in the neighborhood, we were right on the brink of changing the neighborhood, and not changing the neighborhood for the better. So I think that to some degree, there's that same notion around leaders in nonprofits, that will funders think differently of the organization if there is a leader of color? Will the focus of the organization shift to some issue around racial equity as opposed to the primary focus of the organization? I think there are lots of dimensions of implicit bias that we don't necessarily recognize that shape who leads organizations and whether or not we have diversity. I certainly think it's important to note the Meyer Foundation's fund for Black-led organizations and how that's being recognized more and more. But I think that there certainly has been a dearth of leadership, of Black leadership and focus. And so I'm interested in what Kathy has to say.
Well, I was just going to say that Tamara's a lot more tactful about answering the question than I will be. Why the reluctance? I would say racism, implicit bias, ignorance, definitely ignorance, lack of risk taking, lack of courage. What I mean by that is funders that go with the same people that they've always given to. There was a CEO of a foundation that I won't say who it is a while ago here in DC, a very respectable foundation. And she said to me that forget about strategic planning. We really only give to people we like. Leaders we like, period. That's it. I was horrified, but that's, the old way of doing it. That was the safe way. And so I think giving up that safety, and from the nonprofit's point of view, I hear the same thing. And what I'm seeing now is nonprofits are really struggling with this. This goes to the leadership of their boards and their boards. When there are a number of nonprofit executive directors around this city who are trying to do this work desperately, they don't have the money and they don't have their board commitment. The boards think it's sort of a marginalized thing. They don't see why it's a smart investment that they need to pay attention. So, and the struggles are really tough.
Yeah, thank you both. That was very insightful and really very helpful. And Kathy, I find throughout my career that Tamara is always the most tactful person. I usually really step in it, and so I'm glad that I'm not the only one that thinks she's very handles situations delicately. So I'm everyone on the line. I want to make sure that we get to your questions too, so you can start putting them into the chat box there, because I've got just 2 more questions before we want to open it up to everyone. So as we, it's been great to see so many really large foundations invest in racial equity in a big way over just the last couple of months. What do you think are some of the biggest challenges that philanthropic and nonprofit leaders face in this moment as they're working to advance racial equity and achieve racial justice? This could be internally at their own organizations or externally for society. Biggest challenges.
Well, I think the biggest challenge is the invisibility of structural racism and the failure to acknowledge the impact of racism on our country and on our society. There's a normalcy to the predominance of the white worldview. It's just the normal. It's the norm. I like to share, and I share this story with students in the class, that if you're reading a book or you're reading an article, and the article is talking about Katy, and they'll go on and say something about Katy, and then it'll say, and then there was Susan, Katy's Latinx neighbor. And then there was Tamara, Katy's African-American colleague, Katy's race was never defined because white is the default. And I think there are so many instances where if you aren't in a marginalized community, if you are part of the majority population, you don't see that. You don't see, you just don't recognize it because it doesn't impact you in the same way. And I think that sometimes we have to juxtapose situations for people to see the racism and the bias that predominates. Because if you just look at it by itself, you don't really see it. So if you look at something like Kyle Rittenhouse, so this young man in Kenosha, Wisconsin, who's walking down the street with an automatic rifle, and he's arrested ultimately, but police walk by him with this rifle several times to the point that he has raised his hands because he thinks he's going to be arrested. So he goes, he's arrested, and $2 million bail is set. His bail is paid by donations. You have a young man named Khalif Browder, I think Browder is his last name. He was supposedly stole a backpack. He was put in Rikers Island jail for 3 years without ever having a trial because he couldn't pay his bail. But the $2 million for Kyle Rittenhouse is paid. Mm-hmm. Or you look at George Floyd. George Floyd supposedly passed a $20 bill that was counterfeit. He was murdered for passing that $20 bill. But Dylan Roof in South Carolina killed 9 people in a church. He was arrested safely and appropriately. So you have to, I think, juxtapose these situations of what happens in the Black community or in communities of color as compared to the white community. And if that doesn't happen with some degree of intentionality, Katy, I don't think you just notice these things. I don't think philanthropy just notices it, that someone has to point it out. And I think that was part of the power of putting racism on the table, or the power of any kind of structured education around race and racism, because otherwise it's not something you just pick up. You don't see these things if you don't take the time to delve into them. And I think philanthropy is doing that more and more, but it's important to recognize the invisibility of structural racism and bias.
And one of my favorite quotes from one of the participants of putting racism on the table was, "Once you see, you cannot unsee." Mm-hmm. That's right. And I thought that was very powerful. And then you start to see it everywhere. And then, you just, this rabbit hole happens and you see it everywhere. So thank you for that.
But you have to train yourself. You have to train yourself to look for it, or you have to be prompted by either a personal desire or organizational commitment, but something that makes you continue to look for where is one community advantaged and one community disadvantaged in some type of a routine manner.
Yeah. Thank you. Hopefully many of us have been going on our own personal learning journeys just in these last few months, reading and paying attention. And Many Hands is excited to be part of that intentional learning journey starting this fall. So before we jump into some of the questions that are coming in through the Q&A feature, Mary mentioned early as she was opening up that in July, Many Hands issued our first ever statement on racial equity. As we start this journey for ourselves as an organization, as an individuals, if you could offer us some advice on how we could begin incorporating a racial equity lens into our work, where would you suggest we start? What should we be doing internally and externally as an organization, as individuals?
Can I just, I'll just say something on that because I've been thinking about that. Number one, I saw your statement. And I thought it was terrific. So I think you've already started because it sounded very intentional. You recognize, you acknowledge that you have a lot of work to do, and you laid out some of the things that you are planning on doing. And so I think you're already starting to take the first steps. I think that learning journey for you all as a group is going to be really important in terms of how individuals engage and willingness to, on their own, read, on their own, ask questions, again, show their vulnerability in their own lives. But then when you come together as a group, what can you do together? The thing that I noticed is, and you pointed it out in your statement, it's a primarily all-white organization, an all-white board. And so I would ask you all, have you given thought to what you're going to do? Because, one is going internally in yourself, but what are your plans for engaging others so you can have the conversations, black and white, that Tamara was talking about?
Yeah, thank you for that, Kathy. And for many of our members who are on the line, we have a number of initiatives. We've put together a racial equity committee where we're looking at learning opportunities. We're looking at an internal racial equity audit. We are starting to engage and interview potential consultants that will help us with this work. We know that as a majority white board, if we were to do our own racial equity audit, it would be very hard for us to see the things that we need to see because we do have a default white perspective. And so we are putting a number of things in place and hope to roll out a number of those initiatives and announce them to the membership in the new year. So stay tuned for some of that. Thank you. Thank you both for that. Let's go to some of these questions that I'm seeing in the chat feature over here. I love this one. I'd love to hear your view on the Black Lives Matter movement. It seems to be, it started as a simple kind of, not even simple, but a statement, and now has become a little bit divisive. So I'd love to hear how you guys are thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement and its progression over the last couple of years.
Well, I think the Black Lives Matter movement is pretty powerful and needed. And I hope that people on this call certainly can appreciate that the intent is never to say that someone else's life does not matter, but to always underscore the fact that Black lives have not mattered in this country for centuries. And there is example after example, evidence after evidence. George Floyd is one of the most recent examples, but there are many examples that Black lives don't matter. So it's a suggestion and a call to recognize the fact that Black lives have not mattered, and it is time for them to matter, and for white people, to see what society has done that has minimized and marginalized and murdered Black people for centuries.
So sitting in the School of Public Policy, I get a couple questions. Number one is, how can we measure the impact that Black Lives Matter is having? And if it's not through legislation and changing in laws, does it really matter? And I would push back and say, yes, it matters, because it has people thinking about it, people who never thought about it. And so it's informed opinions that have well informed legislation and policy changes and so forth. It's the beginning. It's in the nascent stages. So that's one thing I would say. Here's the other thing I would ask. For all the white people who it really moved, and they have all the posters up on, in their windows and outside on their front lawns, Black Lives Matter. That's wonderful, but what are they going to do next? Is my question. And Tamara,
I just wanted to add to it, Kathy, because I think you started it, that it sometimes feels that people want to move to action before they understand the depth of the problem. And so their actions actually become somewhat superficial. So I actually, and I may be in a different place than others on the call, but I actually appreciate the fact that there is a degree of learning that has to happen before we talked about action. So for me, I've kind of taken on this mantra of reveal, reflect, recalibrate, because it seems like so much has to be revealed. So those people who are just beginning to understand how marginalized and dehumanized Black communities and other communities of color have been in this country, that I hope they take the time to learn. I hope they take the time to understand and to reflect on where we are as a country before moving to action. But obviously, I hope they do move to action. But I know that no one acts unless, we all want to talk about macro level societal transformation. And I think we'll get there. But that level of transformation is led by individual people. So though we have to have individuals who understand and who are committed to transformation, and I think we're getting there. But I want folks to reflect on where we are. Katy, you talking about, specifically about many hands, what caused many hands to exist? Why is many hands here? How long will many hands have to be here? I mean, just to think about what are the power dynamics that have created the need for this organization and that continue for the organization to be needed.
Thank you both. Tamara knows that I love cartoons. I feel like they are so powerful in sharing really complex issues in a very simplistic way. And one of my absolute favorites, I still think about it all the time, is two houses. One is on fire and one is not. And the firefighters are putting the water onto the house that is not on fire. And the neighbor is saying, "What are you doing?" And the firefighter says, "All houses matter." And so for me, it was like, of course, all lives matter, but not all lives are on fire. And that was just a moment for me where it just totally transformed my thinking. So another question from the Q&A here, which I thought is a good one. So Many Hands gives large unrestricted grants. We give $100,000 grant, and our three partner grants receive upwards of $50,000+ each, all in unrestricted. And so the question is, are you saying that by giving these unrestricted grants that we are we're putting Band-Aids on societal challenges, that we're addressing the symptoms of racism and not the cure?
That it's not my intent to say that. I think that when you give unrestricted dollars, that you certainly afford the organizations the opportunity to address the problems in the manner in which they choose. With that being said, the organization may still be addressing a presenting problem without addressing the root cause. So it just feels like that so much has to be done, Katy, to reveal the kind of the depth of racism in this country. And so, for example, there are a lot of folks around who talk about affordable housing, including Rag. But when they are talking about affordable housing, 95% of the time, they are only talking about affordable rental units. And that's critically important. But affordable rental units will never address the wealth gap in this country, the racial wealth gap. The racial wealth gap is really born from the American dream of home ownership. Owning a home is the way that most people acquire wealth in our country. But we are very proud, as we should be, of our efforts to promote affordable housing. But we need to talk about it as affordable rental units, that certainly provide a place to live for families, and it's critically important, but it does nothing to address the wealth gap in America. So those organizations to which you are giving unrestricted funds, I think that it's powerful that you are recognizing their ability to lead and to structure their intervention in the manner that they choose. But they may not be addressing structural racism.
I would say that's very true. I would also say that I think there more groups need to be funding and unrestricted funds. I see too many where, and it really constrains nonprofits when it's program specific. And that happened in COVID. Nonprofits that had unrestricted funds, for the most part, they had an easier time pivoting to different kinds of programs they needed to deliver. Those that had the specific program, it was much harder for them to negotiate how they're going to switch their budgets around. So I think that's a positive thing if you can also think about the other issues that Tamara raised.
Thank you, Tamara and Kathy. Tamara, your example just now of affordable housing is an eye-opening one, I think, for many of us, right? Because we wouldn't have thought about that. We think about affordable housing and workforce housing and how much is needed. As we think about our other four focus areas in many hands, in economic empowerment and health, how can we go deeper in those areas and really look at our grant making through a racial equity lens? As I think about our most recent health grantee, for example, it was on food recovery and a powerful, new, exciting organization. I'm just thinking about, are there ways to unpack those four issue areas through a racial equity lens, just like you did right now for housing?
Well, Katy, you know AppV as does Kathy, originally the Association of Black Foundation Executives, but it's now called AppV. And they do a lot of work on what they call back mapping. It's looking at the presenting situation and then why did that happen? Why did that happen? Why did that happen? To continue to go back to figure out what the root cause of it is. One of the issues around food insecurity, and you talk about the fact that there are areas that are referred to as food deserts. And I didn't have this aha moment. Someone pointed this out to me and they said, let's stop calling them food deserts. We should call it food apartheid. A desert is a naturally occurring phenomenon. There's nothing natural about the lack of grocery stores in certain parts of our cities. That the owners of these stores have made decisions based on certain demographic information about where they will choose to locate their stores. It's not natural. It is not a food desert. And so I think that, so that wasn't, I wish I'd had that aha moment, but I didn't. But time someone said it, I thought, you're absolutely right. So we have to, I think that's the kind of the reveal and reflect, that we have to be prompted in our own education, because it doesn't happen on our own. It just doesn't happen organically. It has to be a learning that we haven't had before.
God, I miss hanging out with you.
Well, come on, let's hang out some, Katy.
And speaking of people I miss hanging out with, Rebecca Cedar has entered a question here, which of course, as always, is poignant. How do we help Many Hands members and those of other giving circles? We're not professional grant makers, we're all volunteer. And so we do get a little hung up on the idea of like measurable impact, professional sounding proposals, flashy site visits. How do we move past some of those kind of hangups that we might have to get through to some of the more structural and systematic changes we want to see?
Kathy, you taking it?
Yeah. I think there's good news is that there's a movement by some larger foundations, and I hope smaller ones, that are beginning to say, you know, in the work that we're doing around racial equity, it's right now it's asking too much for the nonprofits to show us the kinds of measurable goals, outcomes that we want, and so they're thinking, taking a little bit of a step back and saying, what we want people to measure isn't necessarily realistic or smart. What do they want to measure? And so that might be something that you want to consider. It's really not about what your goals are, it's about what their goals are.
And seeing, I mean, I really like what Kathy said, and how do we see, or how do you see as a funder, incremental change? So if a funder was supporting the civil rights movement, and they didn't get the kind of legislation that they needed to have in 1960 or 61 or 62 or 63 or 64, funders would have stopped funding it. They would have said, you aren't getting to where you need to be. But they were tilling the soil. They were creating the environment for change. Change doesn't happen overnight, at least in my world, it doesn't. And so I think when I worked many years ago and for Virginia state government, and I was doing some work on teenage pregnancy prevention, and the legislators wanted to know from one year to the other how many teenage pregnancies were prevented. You know, it's data that you don't have. You know, you don't have data about something that didn't happen. So I just think that we have to have different measures, and we have to recognize that we can't measure everything that's important. We just can't. And every proposal that you see that is sleek and well put together means that you have a sleek and well put together person developing it. And which doesn't necessarily mean that they are the person who's going to speak to the community and who's really going to be able to affect change in a community. So I think it's trust and going a bit out on the limb of faith, and giving organizations time to breathe and to be the agents for change they can be.
Thank you. Change does not happen overnight. That's a good point to end on. Thank you both so much for joining us tonight. This has been an incredible conversation. It's been very helpful for me personally. I hope it's been helpful for the Many Hands members and our guests who are on the line tonight. We are committed to continuing our learning journey, and thank you for helping us kick it off.